So I'd like to use the definition of aggregate demand and a consumption function to depict how we relate income, national aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. So the concept, the mathematical concept that we're going to use for this is the equation of the line, and we're going to use that in combination with these definitions in order to graph this relationship. So again, we get aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending. This is in a closed economy, so we don't have exports and imports to fool around with at this stage. And we have a consumption function which relates the level of consumption with disposable income adjusted for the tax burden, the spendable income, if you will. And we've got this letter B, which represents the marginal propensity to consume. It's a variable somewhere between 0 and 1. It's how many purchases of goods and services I will undertake, or that the economy consumers will undertake if income rises by $1 or $1 trillion or whatever. We're going to keep that constant, so we're not going to let that vary. We're also not going to let it vary across individuals. This is just the average propensity, likelihood to consume out of an extra dollar of income. Okay, so we've got these various components. I want to plug this into the aggregate demand definition. So all I'm doing is plugging in what C is equal to into this equation, plus investment, plus government spending. Now here I'm going to make a simplifying assumption for us at this stage. I'm going to assume that investment does not vary with the overall level of economic activity. That's clearly not true. People could easily invest more when the economy is booming, or when interest rates might change. All sorts of things can affect that. And I'm also going to assume that government spending is fixed, at least in drawing this originally. Okay, so here we've got a number of relationships, and I'm going to rewrite this in the following way. Okay, I'm going to combine, I'm going to pull these over here, and then I'm going to separate this part out. So I'm going to have minus B times T plus B times Y. Now what I've got here is a relationship between aggregate demand and a number of variables, parameters, constants. If I can look at I guess I should actually add down here in some of the Geek Speak videos, we talked about parameters and constants, so take a look at that. That was a use for the equation of the line. Okay, so we've got these parameters and constants plus a positive relationship between aggregate demand and the level of national income, which is associated with this marginal propensity to consume. All right, let's make this simple. And I'm going to simply call all of this whole expression, all that stuff, E. I'm just going to substitute for it. E is part of this. We've got these various things in here, and it'll the level of investment and government spending And taxes will affect this variable E, but I'm just going to shove them all into E plus B times Y. Now that's a lot easier to write, but I want you to keep in mind that E represents all these things. So just to be absolutely clear about this, I want to write that definition of E over here. It's A plus I plus G minus B times the tax burden. Okay, so whenever I write E, I'm going to have that thing in mind. So let's graph this. Here I've got national income, or GDP, I should say, GDP. I've got aggregate demand, and I've got some value, which I'm calling E. That's the y-intercept. It's the intercept on this vertical axis. So when you go back and look at the equation of a line, if you're confused about that, but that E is all this stuff. And then I've got an aggregate demand that has this shape, whose slope is equal to B. Again, this was aggregate demand equal to E plus B times Y. Okay? It's just the slope of a line. So, all we have is that aggregate demand will increase by only a fraction of the level of an increase in income. Why is that? It's the basic idea that you don't consume all of your income. We have a marginal propensity to consume less than one. You don't consume everything. You save at least some of it. Now you might not save very much. You might save a little. That can vary. So when we look at, for example, two different policies that the government might use to influence fiscal policy, or they use fiscal policy to influence the level of economic activity. Let's say that there's an increase in government spending, or a decrease in taxes. Now, I think it should be relatively straightforward conceptually to think, well, if you've got an increase in government spending on goods and services, there's going to be an increase in demand. Okay, that seems pretty clear. If you reduce taxes, that's going to put more income in people's pockets, and they're going to be able to spend more and buy more stuff. An increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes, okay? How does that affect E? If G gets bigger, if the level of government spending goes up, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve up. E gets bigger. if government spending goes up at every level of aggregates of national income, there will be more purchases of goods and services because you've got the consumers doing what they're doing, plus you have an increased level of purchases by the government. An increase in government spending will shift this aggregate demand curve up. If you have a decrease in taxes, if T gets smaller, okay, you'll notice that T is multiplied times minus B. If T gets smaller, that intercept gets bigger. You're subtracting off a smaller number. If T gets smaller, you're subtracting off a smaller number. This line shifts up. So there's actually a very important concept here. Fiscal policy, expansionary government spending, or decreases in taxes have similar results in terms of the aggregate demand. It increases aggregate demand for very different reasons. One, the government, in one instance, the government is spending on goods and services directly. And the other, they're lowering taxes, and consumers are able to, consumers and businesses can choose to purchase more. But in terms of just the aggregate demand side of it, very similar actions. Again, a little bit later, we will talk about how other effects can be very different. Trying to boost up aggregate demand by giving more people more income to spend may have different long-term consequences. So consuming today may be very different than, say, changing the way you treat investment so that you would have potentially more physical capital, more investment in new plants and new equipment. So the long run, it could have different results. But at least in the short run, on this aggregate demand, increase in G, decrease in taxes, shifts the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. So this is showing how we can use the consumption function with the definition of aggregate demand to draw this relationship between aggregate demand and national